Hey, very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Sean.
This is Alex.
And you're listening to another episode of Coaster Kings Radio. And today's episode is called Crazy Rides, Crazier Concepts. Because many rides usually start in like a concept phase, where it's all, pie in the sky, crazy shit. And then in reality, it's not quite as wild.
Yeah, as Disney would say, blue sky concepts.
Yeah, the more PG version.
To get the creative juices really flowing and flesh out as many potential ideas as possible. Just do whatever you could possibly think of for a ride concept, and then they let the guys in budgeting scale it down to whatever is necessary.
Or, the audience. I mean, there's whole rides manufactured that get changed before it even opens, or... one that I don't even have on the list, but Walibi Holland built the outdoor version of Rock and Roller Coaster back in the Six Flags Holland days. Seen it to Riddler, and I realized after already having to paint the track that nobody knew who the Riddler was in the Netherlands, and that it wasn't going to be a marketable ride. So then they repainted it to red and blue colors to make it Superman, and then themed the inside of the station to be themed to, or the Cube building rather.
I actually have another one of those. The Intamin Freefall, which is now gone at Six Flags St. Louis, was originally going to be Acrophobia. And they even painted it like green, orange, and blue. And then decided after it had already painted it that they were going to retheme it to Superman.
That's right. Oh, I missed that ride too.
That was a good ride.
This list that we have compiled today is going to be a variety of rides, mostly in the Western world of theme parking, where concepts have been released for decades now. And these are going to be concepts of all sorts of rides that I think most people do know. I think every single ride in this list, everyone listening is probably going to be familiar with. And then they were conceptualized to be something themed completely different, or just a completely different kind of ride, or a much longer ride, or whatever. Mm-hmm. I'm excited to dive into that. And I think the best one to start with is the OG pie in the sky concept, where I'm still surprised that they even came up with it, and that is the Hollywood Tower Hotel Tower of Terror,
the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror at Disney's Hollywood Studios. At the time, it was still MGM Studios. So I love the concept metamorphosis of this attraction, because this concept did actually start out as an attraction for Disneyland Paris. When they were building the park, they were theorizing the very first time that Disney thought about doing a drop ride in a park was actually for Frontierland at Disneyland Paris, that mineshaft ride concept.
It was also conceptualized, of course, inside Discovery Mountain.
Discovery Mountain, yep.
And then eventually moved to the new park.
The Journey to the Center of the Earth concept, which, we'll get into that a little bit later, because of course Hyperspace Mountain Paris was like kind of the catalyst for this whole episode, admiring all the concepts and the way things changed for that ride, and it's accoutrement rides as well. But so it started out as a Frontierland mineshaft ride, and then became a Journey to the Center of the Earth Discoveryland ride, and then Journey to the Center of the Earth became a different type of ride and went to a different park. And then ultimately, the drop ride concept from Disney finally settled at Hollywood Studios. And it's interesting. I think the most interesting thing about these early concepts for the ride is how it was very clearly, especially in the Journey to the Center of the Earth phase of this concept, it was very clearly an intimate first-generation freefall that was like jazzed up, dolled up, but it had the distinctive L shape. And even as recently as the Tower of Terror concepts, like in this one particular piece of art that we've been admiring, it even demonstrates the way the vehicles would travel up, go forward, which was later even exaggerated and developed further in the final concept of the ride, where the elevator cars move forward from their rising shaft into the drop shaft. But most notably, how the vehicles would fall and then land in a 90-degree elbow, like a first-gen free fall, and would have scenes that would be visible in the ceiling that you would be looking straight up at.
So what is really fascinating to me is when you look at the original concept, which has boosted a similar shape of the building. First of all, the queue was going to be through a giant hotel. In fact, there was going to be this multi-level scenes, and then you were going to go outside for a little bit, and then eventually you would make your way all the way down into the boiler room of the hotel.
Yeah, it was like enormous.
And that's where you would board
concept.
Exactly, yeah. And that's where you would board your ride vehicle, the elevator. Then you would go up, and all about the station and the queue, they would have the scenes that we're so familiar with. The disappearing characters and the long hallway. In fact, there would actually be two scenes there. One of which was it looks like a dance party, which. The cool thing is, in the modern projection mapping they did for the 50th anniversary, they actually paid homage to that because there is a top floor of the hotel they projection mapped, like a ballroom into. Anyway, and then you were to go up one more story where you would have the classic hallway where eventually the mirror would disappear. Then you will move into a shaft right side on the side of it or behind it, and you would do your first drop, and you would drop all the way to below station level. Where you have an underground dark scene, which is really cool. So this was going to have a lot more scenes than we're currently used to, of course, because it's budgeted down. You would have a giant dark ride scene, and then you would go up the big shaft, the big tower. Same thing, one shaft up and then one shaft down. And they would, again, end up underneath where the queue and the station buildings are. And for your next dark ride scene, which was more themed to the Broken Mirror, I guess. The first one was just the usual, every element of the pre-show, and then the second dark ride scene would be after the second drop.
The car would write itself up like a first-gen freefall car does, and by popping itself upright, that would smash the mirror.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept. And then it would ride underneath itself. I mean, this is so complicated compared to even already a complicated version that we have right now.
It was two separate. This concept was like two intimate first-gen freefalls tethered together with a dark ride portion in between, connecting the first tower to the second tower, and then going back. As complicated as the actual ride is, it was conceptualized as something even more
complicated,
and even more astoundingly complex. And it wasn't until the ride had already opened, actually, that one of the main hallmarks of the existing attraction that you have, where the tower, where the elevator cars do multiple drops and rocket up, and you experience positive G's, taking your way up to the tower. The ride was always conceptualized strictly as a drop tower and opened as such, and didn't even receive a second drop in its ride cycle until 1996. So something that I consider to be a major component of this ride, which is not just randomized drop sequences, but just bouncing, doing more than just a slow ride to the top and a free fall, wasn't even part of the ride's concept at any point.
Well, I think that was what we've learned with not just the original tower in Orlando here, but also with Guardians of the Galaxy, Mission Breakout, and then also New Dimension of Chill's Tower Terror at Disneyland Paris, is that I think the time to board vehicles is so much longer. There is more time to do stuff in the main shaft, whether you're on the old version or the newer version towers, that you could add more to it. Because when they reprogrammed Guardians and they reprogrammed the tower in Paris, they updated those drop sequences to be much longer,
it's a
much
longer
more going
ride.
on. And I don't think it at any point has affected capacity because the shaft is just empty otherwise when there's two vehicles parked in the station, you know what I'm saying? In the newer versions.
Yeah.
So, and what I find fascinating on the original concept for the Orlando Tower is that it really only called for one stage. It was almost like an Omnimover-ish kind of way of doing the dark ride.
Yeah.
With then drops in between. But there really wasn't, now we're used to having 4 stations or 3 stations or 6 stations, depending on the iteration, which obviously helps the capacity. But this looks almost like a really bad capacity version of the original, which may have something to do with why they completely changed the script on the concept and did something else. Because if you only can load one elevator at a time, I mean, it's capacity shot in by 3/4
and I think
compared to what we have now.
Vehicles were smaller too in the concept. When you look at the design, when you look at the scenes and the size of the scenes in relationship to the size of the vehicle, the vehicles really did look like little 4-passenger cars, just like the Intamin First Gen Freefalls. They were more in the dune buggy size bracket where you and maybe just 2 or 3 other people would be riding around together in their elevator car. But then expanding it to the very large vehicles that we have now, I think was absolutely necessary. And I think adds to the experience. I think it's more fun to have like a party atmosphere in your elevator car.
So yeah, that is the first ride on our list, and then the next ride on our list, also
totally changing gears,
is Tennessee Tornado, which is obviously Dollywood's Aero looper, kind of like a one of its kind, a mega looper, where Aero really did or attempted to do giant elements. It will be, I must say, it is the smoothest Aero that probably exists as a looper. Ellen Shoki had a way with supports and doing the track thing when he was with Aero, and it came out to be a good ride, but it's short, and it was conceptualized to be something so much more. However, the concept is murky, because the concept that the model that they once made for it shows the current layout as one of the rides. It shows a clone of Anaconda at King's Dominion as a possible layout. And then it still has the mine train in there as well, so maybe they were all supposed to coexist. I'm not exactly sure what their plan was.
I think there was a version of the concept. I mean, the fact that the model came out, it made the rounds on social media this past summer, and of course we saved it in like several places because it's so cool. But the model that came out, it's impressive how nicely Anaconda at King's Dominion, a clone of it, would have fit in the plot. It would have been essentially a terrain coaster. Like, the current setup of the ride, if you've ridden Tennessee Tornado, after the vertical loop, you have the nice big, like, fan curve that climbs the mountain. Yeah. That's where the lift hill and drop would have been for the Anaconda clone. If you can picture it, the lift hill would have scaled the mountain on that side. Just essentially what it does now in its current iteration. Really, the layout is I think they started with an Anaconda clone and then made various tweaks to it. But the second and third inversions, the loop and the Sidewinder, are also essentially in the same place that they would have been if they had just built a clone of Anaconda as suggested potentially in this model system. Also, I think the way they would have done it was building the coaster, like, to get Anaconda to fit in the plot, they would have been able to just build it directly on top of the mine train, which I think is why the mine train is also present in this model. Like, for clearance purposes and stuff, I think it would have been possible to do both, but just extremely expensive and then maybe not necessary. Like, they may not have needed that capacity at the time. They were able to make back some of their expenses by selling the existing mine train to Magic Springs, and saved a lot of money on the execution by repurposing the station, the maintenance barn, the queue. There was so much infrastructure already in place from the mine train that it made sense to do a custom layout that would repurpose those items. But even with the money that they saved by being able to resell the ride and repurpose the infrastructure, they still ran out of money, which is why the ride is so short. Apparently, the expense of carving out the mountain for the first drop, which is incredible. I mean, just an amazing.
I mean, it's one of the biggest highlights, having a giant vertical tunnel. I mean, it's like an RCT dream, right?
It's totally RCT. But yeah, apparently that aspect of the ride cost a lot more money than originally expected. So
I especially really want to ride it again.
Because I think even as recently, even after they had turned the layout into essentially what we have now, instead of a right turn immediately into the brakes, there's rumors that it would have had like 2 corkscrews and a helix. I mean, it would have...
Yeah, like an interlocking corkscrew.
There would have been more elements. Yeah. Which, is, again, kind of lends itself to Anaconda. Either an interlocking corkscrew or a double corkscrew and a helix or some sort of figure 8 thing, which is essentially Anaconda. So it's interesting that, like, they added the first loop, they did some changes, and then they took away the back half of the ride. But when you consider where it started, it's kind of amazing the similarities that it still has to Anaconda. Even right down to the first drop having an underground tunnel, something that both rides still... well, I guess Anaconda's is an underwater tunnel. But, again, the similarities are interesting. The source material never did stray so incredibly far from the original that you couldn't imagine it being where they started versus where it ended. And just a great ride in its own right.
Yeah, I really want to ride it again because, the tunnel underground, it's so unusual. There's only a few rides I've ridden that have that, and it really does make a difference. One of the rides, actually, we were talking about in a little bit. But next up, we're going to be talking about Discovery Mountain, more famously known currently as Hyperspace Mountain, and Disneyland Paris, which was conceptualized to be probably one of Disney's greatest, grandest experiences, and obviously got neutered down to what's still one of Disney's very best rides, but it was conceptualized to be so much more.
This is the reason for the season.
This is the reason for the season.
This podcast episode exists because of our love for the original Discovery Mountain concept at Disneyland Paris, which is a concept that was developed at the same time as the rest of the park, but early on, I think probably from the get-go, they knew that they weren't going to include Discovery Mountain with the opening day developments. I don't think there was ever a plan to open it with the park because even as early as the 80s, they were like, no, this is going to be something that we add later when we want to combat sagging interest in the resort after the fanfare of the first few years subside. Didn't end up working out that way because the park was so underattended and struggling financially and image-wise that they ended up having to pull the trigger on Discovery Mountain pretty much right away. Like, by the end of the 1992 fiscal year, they pulled the trigger not only on Indiana Jones, which was a really kind of a Band-Aid coaster, a quick fix, just to get something in there. That ride actually had one of the shortest development gestations of any major Disney ride. From the time that they decided they wanted something of that nature to the ride opening was an 11-month window, which is unheard of for Disney. It kind of makes sense when you look at that ride. There's not a whole lot to it, although it has developed a cult following and we're huge fans of it. But Discovery Mountain needed a lot more time in the oven. It was a 2-year project once they even had their ideas, what they could realistically build, narrowed down. It started out really as a subsection of Discoveryland, a whole area, a massive indoor experience with multiple attractions. Space Mountain would have been a roller coaster inside of Discovery Mountain that would have been hanging kind of in the ceiling of this enormous cone-shaped building. It kind of kept the same architectural flourishes as the OG Space Mountains, but just amplified it and gave it the copper and oxidized metal flourishes of Discoveryland and Jules Verne and whatnot. But there was no way that even if Disneyland Paris had been extremely financially successful, the concept for Discovery Mountain would have absolutely needed to be scaled back.
I mean, I wouldn't say that's absolutely needed to be scaled back, because if they ever were, I'll say there was a complete success right at the gate, maybe they would have done it, because that was, some of the crazier times for Disney. But other things that were supposed to be included in Discovery Mountain is, first of all, there's going to be a special entrance where you would have to go through the existing Videopolis, which is the giant theater/dinner area that is in Discoveryland, and then you would go all the way up to the top of it, and there's 2 tubes. And the tubes were installed, except for the bridge into the mountain was never installed. And that's where you would walk into Discovery Mountain as one of the multiple entryways, in which you would find just 3-4 attractions. The train was even conceptualized to go through it. I mean, it was going to be pretty much hovering over the existing Discoveryland. And we're finding a lot of the concepts back in the park, such as the roller coaster did make it. Nautilus, even though it didn't get a dark ride, it got a walkthrough attraction that is right underneath / next to the lagoon of Discovery Mountain, Space Mountain. So we do find some of that back. But anyway, there was supposed to be 2 tubes that went into the mountain. And then once inside, you also had, like you mentioned earlier in the episode, the first generation Intamin drop ride that would stick out of the mountain. And then you would have your roller coaster. And the roller coaster was conceptualized to be seen from many places within the mountain. Like, you would walk around, the roller coaster would zoom by, and there would be a walkthrough, and the roller coaster would be, all around you. And the cool thing is, when it did eventually build Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon, the Terre à la Lune, they did have the whole queue almost as a walkthrough where you would look around you, and the coaster was all around you, and you could see the themed elements, and it was all transparent, where you walking to the roller coaster was part of the experience. It wasn't like, we can't see the ride because it's, we're going to space later. You were already in Discovery Mountain. You were already in the vibe. That was the original iteration of the roller coaster. That has since, of course, changed a little bit again.
And it's amazing to think that... So this ride in 1995 cost... Like, the version that we got, this was the budget version that we got, cost $90 million in 1995, which, adjusted for inflation, is about $162 million. And so the thought... to imagine them building the original concept that included not just one e-ticket, but 3, possibly 4. There's a rumor that they would have built or even relocated Horizons from Epcot, because Horizons, for those of you who don't know, I mean, Horizons...
So yeah, real quick, adjusted for inflation, that would currently have been $181 million.
$181 million for just the version...
Just to build Hyperspace Mountain.
The coaster.
Yeah.
And the building and stuff. So this ride was, by an enormous margin, huge margin, the most expensive ride or roller coaster ever built. And it was a huge gamble because Disneyland Paris was absolutely hemorrhaging money at the time. Like, in 1994, things were so dire that Disney almost had to forfeit the resort to the banks because they were defaulting on their loans. So this was the ultimate Hail Mary pass of, like, it's do or die. Like, if we don't get people interested in this resort and garner, like, international buzz, then it's not going to work. This whole thing is going to come crashing down. And they did. That ride was an international phenomenon. I remember seeing it advertised on Disney Channel when I was a kid living in California. A roller coaster in Paris in the 90s being advertised around the world. You grew up with advertisements for it.
Oh, yeah. I still remember, like, seeing magazines and seeing pictures of Space Mountain and, being taunted as, like, the fastest launching coaster or something, or like the first this and first that. I mean, it was like, they were marketing it, and this was well into the 2000s, that it was marketing just that ride. Because, of course, the ride is as old as I am, if not a year older. And when I was a kid and I was able to read, and I was just like reading on my own, there was still advertisements in magazines, and there was ads for it. And like that marketing campaign must have gone on for at least 10 years. At least 10 years, because... I still remember Hong Kong Disney opened, and it was also an ad about that in the magazine in 2005. And I still remember there was a whole section on Space Mountain in Paris.
Yeah,
that was also in the same magazine.
Probably because Mission 2 was 2005 as well.
Maybe that's why.
I mean, they pretty much were. That ride was the figurehead of advertising that entire resort. Even after Rock and Roller Coaster opened, Space Mountain was the focal point for the entire operation for 10 years, and then went straight into Mission 2 and its advertising campaign. And even to this day, I mean, that ride is on everything. Even if you're not a Star Wars person, that's okay. The ride, the show building, is on all of the merch. It's everywhere. It's really a park icon of unparalleled significance, even compared to the other Space Mountains at the other parks. But yeah, I just can't imagine how much it would have cost to do the original iteration. It would have been like the price of building Disneyland Paris to begin with. Like, it was like building a second gate to do. But
it really was like a giant indoor land. It was almost like Discovery Land had a new land within the land, which now is a lot more common than back in the day. But
like, I can guarantee you that I don't think even Walt Disney Studios cost $90 million to build when they built it, because
that's when they were so
yeah. So the fact that they had this roller coaster that cost as much as a park, a cheap park, a bad park, and then the original concept was for like a park within a park with like 4 rides and 2 levels and all this stuff, and it's like, if only there was just unlimited money.
Could you imagine?
Yeah.
So for sake of time, we're going to move on because we're moving at a snail's pace. We're moving at a pace. There's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
Luckily, the next couple of rides will be quicker talk. So next up, we have Jurassic World and Universal Studios Beijing, which most people know it's the same ride system as Transformers or Spider-Man at Islands of Adventure. However, it was originally conceptualized to be an inverted suspended dark ride in the infamous sphere ride vehicles that we see in the Jurassic World movie. The one that falls off the cliff and all the good stuff. Which makes a lot of sense because when you're on the ride, that is a prominent kind of feature or a prominent theming element is the gyrosphere. However, that concept, it was too hard to do. It was too hard to build a dark ride that involved either suspended from the ceiling or even attached to the ground a gyrosphere ride vehicle. So they ended up doing the classic ride vehicle. And the dark ride looks like it's one of Universal's very best dark rides, hands down. Can't wait to hopefully ride it next year. But it really was originally conceptualized to be a gyrosphere dark ride. Could you imagine?
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense why they ultimately had to stick with what they knew. I mean, you have the Spider-Man and Transformers ride system that is like tried and true. You've got it. You've got a brand new resort, brand new park. This is the signature focal point attraction for this whole resort. Like, it has to work. You have to get it right the first time. So I think ultimately it was the right choice to stick with a ride system that was a safe bet and let the ride's scenes and animatronics do the heavy lifting, which they do. Because, I mean, we've only seen like YouTube POVs of this thing, but God, it videotapes beautifully. It is a fabulous looking attraction, and I don't think the fact that the ride system technology itself is 25 years old is at all a detractor from this ride being a next generation, next level modern experience. Plus, there's the capacity. I don't think the gyrospheres as depicted in the films only hold 2 people. I could see that just being a very challenging.
Yeah, or doing doing a 16-passenger version of it. I mean,
yeah,
it would maybe. Yeah, I think maybe quite early on they realized that wasn't going to work out, especially if it's going to have to carry the dark ride status of the resort. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they're already building Transformers, so for maintenance and purposes, maybe it was just better to do the same ride system twice.
Absolutely.
Which is just the only park that has the exact same ride system twice in the same park.
In the same gate, yeah.
Because Universal, of course, and Orlando have the same resort, but not the same park.
Yeah.
So that is actually kind of interesting. Next up on our list, we have Incredicoaster. You may think, why is that on there? It's mostly on there for the Incredicoaster version of the ride, because when they announced in 2017 that they were going to do Pixar Pier for 2018, they released a bunch of renderings, a bunch of concept arts, and they were going to add show scenes to the previous California Screamin' roller coaster, now Incredicoaster, sorry. And one part of that concept included an entirely covered final helix with a tunnel into the brake runs with a tunnel, and then having indoor scenes going all the way back into the ride station. However, that didn't happen. They just built a small outdoor scene at the very end. I would have loved an extra tunnel, to be honest with you. Yeah,
I think enclosing everything from the last helix all the way through the station and all the way up to the first launch, actually, it's a shame that the budgets were cut where they were, because I feel like California Screamin' was already a victim of budget cuts. All of California Adventure 1.0 was a budgetary move, and so the ride always felt like a really solid blank canvas, but still a blank canvas, and this was an opportunity to give the ride some life and substance and give it some scenes. And even though the 2 scenes that it has a scene at the beginning and a scene at the end, and they're very cute, but it's just unfortunate that they could have really done proper dark ride moments for this ride with the concepts that they had developed. Plus, I just feel like the brake runs and stuff, the business end of this ride that is visible to all on the final breaks and at the very beginning, it's just not, it doesn't give themed ride. They kind of had to, it's sort of a cop-out because it's a roller coaster themed to a roller coaster. And even the characters, I love how in the pre-show Violet is not sold on the fact that the city named an old roller coaster, as she puts it, after the family, which is kind of a clever way to acknowledge the fact that the ride was budgeted to death again, and they couldn't even afford to paint the whole thing for the relaunch of the ride. I think the ride, I like it. I think it's interesting and clever, and they gave it a good shot. What they did end up doing with the themed tunnels and stuff, they did some interesting stuff. It's still, I think it attracts more people than it did as California Screamin', and I don't know, they tried. It would be nice, in a perfect world, they would add more to it and do things like the Jack Jack scene with the airtime hills towards the end. The Jack Jack guys were supposed to bounce up and down, but instead they're static. that part's actually really weird for me because I feel like we're looking at so much hardware and backstage to even like find the little Jack guys that we're supposed to be looking at. I don't know. But who knows? Maybe they'll inject a little more funding into that ride later to kind of polish it up a little bit. But for now, it's all right. It's all right. It's not bad. It's not great. But it's something. It's interesting. It could be worse. Let's see. Oh, yes. Okay, we're just going
next up on our list
going up to 5.
is what I'm pretty excited for, and this is the original theme of Superman the Escape at Circus Magic Mountain. Of course, Superman at Magic Mountain was a limit-pushing, just like Hyperspace. It was in the early day of launch roller coasters, and Intamin had figured they were going to do a magnetically launched system to get the trains up to, 100 miles per hour, supposedly. I don't know if Superman... I guess Superman did reach that in the beginning, but it didn't run at that speed for its entire lifetime. But originally, the ride was concept as Velocitron, which honestly cool nowadays name. Sounds like a
robot of dinosaur,
cool Orlando roller coasters. But really, it was themed to a factory with lots of almost like sci-fi-ish vibes, and a giant turbo machines that would be tubes that the ride vehicles will launch out of, and then there will be a giant laser that would come from a focal point in the entrance area that would point all the way at the top of the tower and then would reflect off of a mirror there. It was a crazy pie-in-the-sky looking concept that was actually really close to being creative. There's blueprints and everything for it. I think it looks awesome. I'm a little surprised that Superman never got tunnels. I mean, it has a small tunnel in the beginning, but other than that, you're just going outside for the entirety of the launch. But yeah, it was conceptualized to have tunnels almost the entire way to the tower, which Tower of Terror in Australia did. That's now closed. Yeah, it looks very cool. I like all the themes.
It was themed.
It even respected the Japanese rock garden kind of vibe that Samurai Summit originally had. And then kind of by using a bridge with traditional touches of Japanese architecture, you would come over to the building of Velocitron. It also looks like the Velocitron entrance plaza had viewing windows into the tube so you could see the trains launch away. Very cool concept. I don't want to say I'm sad it didn't happen because it's like Fortress of
Solitude.
That one is also really neat.
Yeah.
But you can't help but look at a concept like this and think, wow, that's such a neat idea, original idea.
Yeah, with the laser and stuff.
Yeah, Velocitron, I mean, it looks like, some sort of factory that created this crazy machine that just launches, which when Superman opened, that really was crazy. The ride that went 100 miles an hour, launch, shot up almost 400 feet. It was unheard of in 95,
And then this concept actually made its way to Six Flags St. Louis the following year, but both times the themes for these attractions were upstaged by DC Comics characters. Obviously, Mr. Freeze was what Six Flags St. Louis ended up getting, but originally it was conceptualized as a smaller version of Superman the Escape. And then they ended up, developing the Mr. Freeze setup, which I think Six Flags St. Louis still got a pretty good deal with getting a Mr. Freeze clone instead of like a 200-foot version of Superman. Oh, okay. So now we need to go back to Disneyland. We're going to talk about...
We need to go back to Disneyland.
Okay, so the rocket rods... I think I just, gave people terrifying flashbacks to this experience, or their attempts at experiencing this experience. Rocket rods at Disneyland started out as a concept for Tokyo Disney, where you would ride... So Tokyo Disney never built a people mover type attraction. But in the 90s, there was a concept for them to build a people mover-esque attraction that was a thrill ride called Rocket Bikes. And it was like a motorcycle ride that went along an elevated track. That concept never really truly died because I feel like when you look at Tron, you're getting... that's what you got, in a sense. Is the rocket bikes from Tokyo Disney resurrected. The bikes were transformed into vehicles, rocket rods, I think because it was for capacity and accessibility reasons. And when Tokyo Disney ultimately passed on the concept, it trickled its way to Disneyland, where they thought it would be a good idea to reuse the People Mover track for this thrill attraction. Extremely short-sighted, because as we all know, the People Mover track was not in a construction position to support the heaviness of the vehicles and the remodel of the track and the constant accelerating and braking of the vehicles because they cut the budget for banked turns.
And then one thing that I must admit that was actually kind of interesting is that when Disneyland conceptualized doing rocket bikes, they actually conceptualized doing it themed to Star Wars. To was it Return of the Jedi?
Yeah.
And do like the Jedi and or like the speeder bikes.
Yeah.
So that was actually the first concept of it being applied to Disneyland, which kind of makes sense given the success of Star Tours at the time.
And it's funny because now things come full circle, just like how I just said that Tron was sort of like the second coming of Tokyo Disney's Rocket Bikes concept. Now we're looking at there's a concept for a speeder bike clone of Tron for Disneyland Paris.
Yeah, for their Discovery's Land
Edge
expansion, Discovery's Edge, a Star Wars land. For those that haven't heard of it, the concept would be for it to be located where the old Pizza Planet restaurant was, which is on the other side of the train tracks.
Yeah,
over on the side of the. What is the show called again? Filler Magic Theater. And then the land would practically kind of sit behind the show building for Star Tours, which then the concept is that you would board Star Tours and you would arrive in the new land, and that's where you would exit into the land, and that land would then host a Tron clone that is completely themed to Star Wars. Please make it happen.
I know, please.
I love Tron, but I love the idea of a custom Tron speeder bike version just as much, honestly.
I think the funny thing about Rocket Rod, since this is a concept art episode, now this was never, I don't think, ever intended to pan out to anything, but there was concept art for Tron, or for Rocket Rods in the queue that was thematic, and it showed the Rocket Rods network of vehicles expanding beyond the park. There was like a track that went to California Adventure. There was a track that went to the convention center. I don't think there was ever actually any intention to do this with the ride, but it's fun that one of the theme elements for Rocket Rods was concept art that demonstrated lofty premise that never obviously went anywhere, and even the ride on its best day was just a complete fiasco. But a really fun ride, I will say, is I have very fond memories of it in my childhood, even though it was not a success. And I really hope that there's more development in the future of Tomorrowland Disneyland. Like, Tomorrowland needs to be fixed desperately. It seems like Disneyland Resort will do everything under the sun except take on that project. And I think they know, because it means rides are going to close, lots and lots of demolition. I mean, the entire People Mover track has to be demolished, and it's like situated over the infrastructure of several existing rides, so it's going to be a mess, but someday they'll do it.
Next up on our list is Ripsaw Falls at Universal's Islands of Adventure, which most people are familiar with. This ride. It is a Mack log flume that kind of has water coaster portions throughout the ride, and most of the ride is just a single track flume ride, quite long, quite expensive, quite detailed, and then you end with splitting up into two drops because of the spacing of where the boats need to be, given the giant underground drop, and having the airtime hill afterwards, and then having two separate stations at the end. So from the top of the big drop all the way until boarding, it is two stations. Anyway, it was actually conceptualized to be something completely pie in the sky. They wanted to create a singular boat that was 2x2, almost like, say,
Splash Mountain
in Orlando, but then you wouldn't touch each other. It wouldn't be shared benches. It'd be individual seats. Then when you get to the top of the lift on the big drop, a thematic buzzsaw would simply saw your boat into two halves as you would go down the drop.
Down the middle, and then each side would go down
two
its own
different,
drop.
like two different ride vehicles. How exactly they wanted to achieve this, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, that's all concepts, but conceptually, if you look at some of the really, really old concepts, it's very clear that you can see boats traveling on a singular flume, side by side, and at the very top of the hill is when there's two boats coming down that are individual small inline boats. Yeah, really cool.
There's some concepts of how that scene would have worked. And, I will say, to their credit, the ride actually strayed away from this concept as little as possible. Obviously, they did the single inline boats for the entire ride. I love inline boats for log flumes. I prefer them over the two abreast flumes because I think you just get a full range of view. And then the buzzsaw scene at the top of the drop is still there, and when the boats either go down the left or right shaft, it's represented by the buzzsaw splitting the flume into two halves, and then you go down one or the other in a sort of like a aero hydro flume-esque sort of way. So, to their credit, they really loved that idea of the boats being divided, of the flume at least being divided in half by the buzzsaw, even though they could never figure out a way to do a double inline boat that literally gets split in half midway through the ride. But points for creativity, and obviously they still developed a fabulous ride that a lot of people love, that is extremely well liked and well revered in the lexicon of flume rides. So not much was lost. It's not like it was something that was totally possible and cut for budget reasons. It's just the technology didn't exist, and it was kind of a fun idea, but not something that could really have been done.
And then we're moving on to...
Oh, we're still in Florida.
We're staying in Florida. We're moving on to Disney World, and we're going to talk about Space Mountain at Magic Kingdom, which was the first of the Space Mountains built. And it's 2 tracks, for those that aren't familiar with this version of Space Mountain. Unlike all the other ones, it's 2 tracks, 2 stations. And even though the tracks are pretty much mirrors of one another, by a few inches being off, the original concept actually called for Space Mountain to be 4 tracks.
Yeah.
And it called for it to go outside. Like, the whole idea was that Space Mountain would be the physical mountain where you would go in and outside, almost like a space-themed Matterhorn.
And it was so cute. I loved, so like at the Disneyland Hotel, they still have one of the like concepts, like blue sky concepts for the park that was developed in the 60s, and it had an early version of Space Mountain that was massive and had... I originally thought that the tracks being outside of the ride was just a flourish to like show people looking at the map that it was a roller coaster. But you're right. They really thought, like, they really wanted the ride to like pop out of the show building.
Yeah, for those that are interested in watching or seeing something more about it, if I'm not mistaken, the Behind the Attractions series on Disney Plus actually mentions how it was supposed to go outside and then go back inside as like the concept of the ride.
And yeah, I think it was fascinating, the concept of it being a 4-track roller coaster. That would have been like incredible capacity, but even 2 tracks for Magic Kingdom Space Mountain is like quite the operational undertaking. The ride's pretty weirdly complicated with like its unload that is like in a basement and the load that is on top of it, and the empty vehicles dispatch into a little hidden lift hill that takes them up to the top. It's very fascinating. It's still, for its time, like in its day, Space Mountain and Magic Kingdom was still quite an impressive mechanical thing. I hope that they give that ride a major top-down remodel and bring it at least into the 21st century, because it's just old and janky and fun in ways that are ironic and not futuristic. So maybe they can give Tron like a proper sibling, something that's actually futuristic and modern and clean looking at some point.
And next on our list is Powder Keg at Silver Dollar City, which started its life as, what was the original name?
Buzzsaw Falls.
Buzzsaw Falls, yeah. So straightforward.
A Premier Rides liquid coaster. Because the ride, I mean, it ran for several years, and it struggled with reliability, struggled with capacity. So I guess after about, it was less than 10 years, they called it quits and called up Premier Rides to turn the ride into a launched roller coaster. But it was still supposed to be a ride that it had a water component, like a simulated splashdown.
Yeah, so a lot of the concrete infrastructure, the basins of the Buzzsaw Falls ride were to remain in place, which they are remaining in place. They are still there. However, they were supposed to be filled with water, and it was going to be water effects. And even Powder Keg's launch was supposed to be over water with a water effect, as it, almost as if it was scooting across the water, because the trains are barrel themed. And so the original idea of doing Powder Keg is reusing some of the ride, the track of the water coaster that was previously there, adding more track to it, doing a an air pressure log, and then paying homage to the original theme and the new theme is having a bunch of simulated water effects, including, again, the water effects upon launch, where you cross a body of water. And then when you get back to the ride building area, after the final drop, there was supposed to be a simulated splashdown using water infrastructure
water
of the
cannons,
previous ride. Yeah.
Sort of like, that's sort of what the Daredevil Falls at Dollywood does. Those Hopkins super flumes, they can really turn the splash on or off depending on the weather. Like, you can still ride that flume in the winter, and you don't have to worry too much about getting soaking wet because the brakes and stuff are magnetic. I think it has magnetic brakes. Now I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just thinking of Jurassic Park at Universal Studios Hollywood. But yeah, I feel like for Hershon Family Entertainment, for a company that is so polished and their concepts, even when they get shrank like Tennessee Tornado did, they usually come out looking really nice. I wish that that Powder Keg, like when you do the drop after the lift hill, there's like, you can see how they built one small concrete basin that was presumably going to be for a splash effect, and then they just kind of gave up partway through. I wish they would either finish it or tear it down, because it just looks like ugly, abandoned infrastructure that does not fit the theme of the ride at all. It doesn't even look like dilapidated and worn down in a way that like the flume portion does, that is sort of thematic. It just looks like a concrete cube that shouldn't be there.
And then next on our list is the Crushers Coaster at Disneyland Paris, which was originally conceptualized very, very way back as being an indoor coaster, but being a kids coaster called Mickey's Band Coaster, where you would go into a show building that was themed to a soundstage, and you would go around, a cartoonish world, kiddie coaster style, with Mickey and a bunch of band theming.
I forgot about that. It was themed to the band concert short, just like Silly Symphony Swings.
Yeah, and it was themed to be in Soundstage 28, and it was going to be a soundstage just like our current soundstage that we have for Crushers Coaster. And Crushers Coaster was conceptualized to be almost like a mirror roller coaster, two sides of a classic Maurer spinning coaster. And it was going to have two show buildings for it. And the original ride concept even called for sitting on the back of a turtle shell, but then everyone facing forward. That's, of course, been changed to people sitting back-to-back in the more traditional Maurer style. And the original name was supposed to be Crushers Turtle Twister, which I think is a cute name.
Yeah.
In fact, I feel like I called it that before.
Yeah, I think they had to change it because they just wanted it to be more obvious to people what it was.
Yeah. And so, for those that aren't super familiar with the Crushers Coaster roller coaster at Walt Disney Studios Paris, it is a Maurer spinner roller coaster that features a dark ride section. You start off in the station, make a turn, have a lift hill, and then you end up on top of the lift hill. You go outside through a little blue reef.
That's so cute. The ride has such fabulous curb appeal.
And then once you get inside, there is show scenes, like a dark ride, maybe like 3 or 4 rooms where you go through with little drops and stuff in between. And depending on which way you're facing, which is really, really fun, you get different scenes. So if you're facing forward on the ride, you are seeing a different scene than where you're facing backwards. So there's a scene where you see the big underwater mine, like the bombs, whatever they are.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
but if you're facing backwards, what you're seeing is the reef of all the jellyfish. The oceans of jellyfish. And there are several scenes that kind of work like that. and then using the bilingual aspect of having one character speak French, the other speak English. It all works really well. We're big fans of the ride.
I love this ride.
And I think Disneyland Paris was in a budget situation, so they only built one side of it, meaning the capacity isn't great. Even though they push those trains out continuously, I think capacity is about 960 on that.
But at least the ride itself, the experience, once you get on the ride,
it's fantastic.
They didn't budget they didn't have to cut the budget for the experience itself, just the capacity.
So that's a great little roller coaster. But yeah, it was originally conceptualized to be two sides, which would have really, I think, worked with the capacity for sure.
Disneyland Paris, if you're listening, it's not too late to build a second Crush.
Right, it's never too late.
Just build another one right next to it.
I mean, we know it's popular.
The ride is eternal. We will always love it.
Anything else on that matter?
No, I think that covers it.
Cool. Moving on to California.
We were just there and we only got to ride it once because it was big broke on the last day when we were going to ride it again. And I miss it. I'm ready to go back and ride it some more.
So then we're going to jump to Viper Six Flags Magic Mountain, which has seen a couple changes since it opened, especially after the first season because the drop wasn't banked properly. So it was tearing itself up and there weren't enough supports to support the fan dirt turn that comes after the first vertical loop, and all the vertical loops had to be replaced with reinforced loops. So Viper had seen its fair share of updates after the
It's crazy they didn't learn their lesson with Shockwave or Great American Scream Machine. Like, by the time they built Viper, they should have known that the tops of the loops needed extra bracing and that the turnaround was going to need buttressing, but it was all still stuff that they figured out after the ride opened.
But then the original concept actually called for Viper to have a highly elevated turn on top of the lift, and then followed by a big vertical loop. By a big vertical drop going down, and then the rest of the ride layout was supposed to be pretty similar.
It looked like El Toro, you guys. It was really cool.
And I think that kind of makes sense because when you look at, for example, Vortex at Kings Island, that is unfortunately no longer with us, that also had a turn and like a big straight drop.
It was like that.
It would have been really cool for Viper to do that
awesome.
too, especially because this was before Magic Mountain had any sort of hyper-style rides. Those were all not really a thing yet, and besides Magnum. But I think maybe there was even a little bit of an inspiration there of like, okay, maybe we'll include a big drop, like a big moment of airtime before doing the rest of the ride. Didn't happen. But still really cool nonetheless.
It was immortalized in one of the park's 1990 brochures where the concept of Viper was what graced the front page of it because there was no physical ride to photograph when they were putting those in print. So if you search like Six Flags Magic Mountain 1990 park map or brochure, you will find the concept art for Viper gracing the front of this pamphlet.
And so next up, we have Kali River Rapids at Animal Kingdom at Walt Disney World.
This one is really, really wild.
This one is literally
probably
wild.
The wildest concept.
First of all,
ever.
It wasn't meant to be a circular rapids ride from the original concept. It was actually going to be a raft ride, much like, for example, River Adventure, the Jurassic Park rides at Universal Studios or Hollywood or Islands of Adventure, Japan, the ones. Where you would all be facing forward, but you were going through animal exhibits. And we're not just talking a few animal exhibits. We're talking really up-close encounters, animals really close to the vehicles. Of course, that was then eventually scaled back to be a little bit further away from the vehicles, and then circular rapids ride, to the point where they realized they couldn't do any of that without staffing every boat for safety purposes, because you don't want a bunch of unaccompanied boats, up to hundreds of people at a time, going through animal exhibits, not being able to tell what's happening with the animals or the passengers, or not being able to get to them quick enough. So it actually ended up being a completely neutered down version where I think it just skipped to the good part, right? Like, it just kind of skipped all the animal exhibits and then went straight to just being the rapids ride. Because when you look at the Africa... when you look at the whole area that Kali River Rapids is in, a lot of the concept art things do come back. You have the island with the monkeys, and two of them actually. There's two animal exhibits that are right around the Kali River Rapids that the ride was supposed to go through. One of which it does kind of go by still, so I guess we got one animal exhibit that we actually got. Sure. And then you can see where the ride was supposed to start and kind of go through the Maharajan jungle track and have elements in there before going up the lift hill and doing what it's doing now with this little conservation message. But really, the ride is super short now because it was conceptualized to be twice as long, but having a giant animal aspect to it that doesn't exist.
Gives away the ride's original scope quite like the shortness of the ride that we have now. I mean, look at this concept art for the whole park. I mean, look how massive.
Yeah, Color was supposed to take up pretty much all of Asia, and it only took up maybe like a third of it.
And that there's still land behind Kali River Rapids that was originally earmarked for it that is still not developed. Like, they can still put something really major back there.
And it's crazy because the more you look, the more concepts are out there of it just going through the animal, like an Asian elephant.
They ultimately, I feel like this goes without saying now, but ultimately they decided that they shouldn't have wild animals and an unpiloted vehicle attraction like a boat in a flume. Those things are not going to mix.
And it's funny because then you look at concepts when they shifted gears from being rafts like Jurassic Park to being circular rapid rafts. All the concepts have over-the-shoulder restraints, like hard restraints, and everyone's holding onto them in the concept, which obviously never happened either. We just went with really basic boats. But I do love the ride. It's just that it could have been so much more.
Not having a restraint system on a circular
water ride,
setup. That's a big
But I think because it was one of the first to do a drop, if not the first major rapid ride in the world to have a proper drop. Yeah. I think that was really like, what do we do to keep people from falling? And then next on our list is the Batman and Robin the Chiller, which I'll let Alex talk a little bit more about this because it's literally his phone background.
So this concept for the Chiller was something that I stumbled on by accident looking at concept art for Mr. Freeze. Mr. Freeze, more or less, was built in the image of the concept, whereas the Chiller... The original concept, so the Chiller, I always thought, had kind of a puzzling sequence of events. I always thought it was odd that instead of a vertical spike, like the Mr. Freeze coasters, it had a 45-degree angle spike, and it had the really cool zero-G rolls after the Cobra roll and or top hat element. And the ride would tear those up, would just barrel right into them, because they were relatively low. They kind of seemed like they were part of the spike. But like at the very beginning, like the beginning of your gravity spike into the magnets that would push you up further and then shoot you back farther to get you back to the station in one piece. It kind of seemed like it was all one element, but I also felt like it was kind of odd. Originally, the ride was developed. It had the same kind of sequence of events leading up to once you exited the Cobra roll or the top hat, you would then enter an Immelman, a half loop of sorts, and then twist out of it, and then continue at a 45-degree angle up. And so, because it's an Immelman, now the 45-degree angle spike would actually go over the top of the top hat and the Cobra roll. It would clear it. It was sort of like, I don't know, it was like a little acute angle. Like you would come out of it and you would barrel into this very sharp Immelman type thing and then twist out of it and then roll over the top. I mean, it's amazing. Great Adventure History has the concept art for this thing, and it is so wild. I mean, this would have killed you. Like the Immelman.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concept art was really meant to just showcase the possibilities because, again, let's not forget that it was supposed to be a complete 360 twist on the back of the top hat too. They come down the top hat, do a complete 360 like Topsail Dragster.
The original like King of the Ka moment. Yeah, that's true.
So obviously the concept, but I think the most important takeaway from this concept is that it was really meant to be stacked on itself. So unlike what we've seen at the end, where
it took up all the space,
where it took up almost like a parallel movement, where both inversions were elements that would put you in opposite direction, and then on the side of the station you would have your spike. This was really meant to be stationed someplace and then launch and then continue over itself with for the spike. Completely different concept than what we end up getting, and even what we end up getting was honestly pretty wild. So
yeah, and it all just
really sad.
What seemed like such an odd choice with the inversions and the 45-degree angle. It was such a fun light bulb moment when I finally stumbled on this concept art. Because it's like, oh, that's why they wanted to do it this way. That's why it was 45 degrees instead of vertical. That's why there's a a seemingly random inline twist at it. Like, they really just wanted to keep the essence of the original ride concept as much as they could while having to make the necessary changes that would.
And it really was a cool ride. I'm super sad that it didn't last. And I think it would have if it didn't mess with the power grid. Because, at the end of the day, if you look at the other Premier rides, they're almost all overbuilt. Like, they are so over-supported, over-structured. They are beefy rides. And the Mr. Freezes are alive and well. The spaghetti bowls are alive and well. I think this ride would have lasted if it wasn't just such a nightmare maintenance-wise. And I just think that they couldn't handle the early LSM doing two and launching at the same time. It was kind of a mess.
And the zero-G rolls were a struggle for them, too. That's another clue. There's just clues of this ride having a different concept than what was originally built, because the fact that the zero-G rolls were sort of a compromise from the original concept, and then it proved to be a problematic component of the ride, going like in the long run to the point where they had to replace them as like part of a last-ditch effort to get the ride functional. It all just is very telling that like the zero-G rolls were not something that was as well thought out as like everything else prior in the ride experience. But what are you gonna do? It was points for ambition. It's a really cool ride, and I would be nice if Premier Rides would build a modern version.
Speaking of barrel rolls and rides that didn't quite work out, Maverick,
beautiful segue
at Cedar Point. And I'm sure many of our coaster nerds on this podcast know exactly what we're talking about. Used to have a not zero-G roll, a barrel roll that you barrel through so quickly that it could pretty much murder you. And they conceptualized this, and then they made a video renderings of it, and then they built it, and then they tested it. It got that far to the point where they realized, we can't do this. The test dummies are just like exploding. That's
right. The heads on the test dummies were exploding.
And so instead, they were forced to take it out and replace it with a rather dull but still really fast element. I mean, I still can't believe that was supposed to be zero-G. I mean, a barrel roll.
And then the Mosasaurus roll came and gave us what we had been missing in our lives.
And the Mosasaurus roll is the final roll on Velocicoaster here at Islands of Adventure. Just a quick little throw in there. Skyrush will be a quick one, too. What were the differences again on Skyrush's concept?
There was a no limits Skyrush concept
that Hershey Park
released. Yeah. That was just not accurate. It had like a little helix there at the far end, and it was just, I don't know how much of that was just somebody not really following the design, or if that was a reflection of an earlier design, and then by the time it was released they had already made changes. But yeah, Skyrush had some funny, I don't even know if that video is still like on YouTube or anything, but there was like the announcement video for Skyrush in No Limits showed definitely a noticeably different version of the ride, especially towards the back half of it. But nothing crazy. Again, I don't think there was nothing lost really with what was emitted from that version of Skyrush, if that was even a real like version of the layout.
And then next up on our list is PortAventura World. And originally, of course, built by or conceptualized by Busch, built by Busch, sold off to be operated by Universal, this, that, and the other. We've got a whole episodes on it early in the season.
Yeah, it was Madame Tussauds for a while.
There was a lot going on.
Had their fingerprints all over this place.
But the nice thing is that Busch, the bones are incredible, and they put a lot of money into it. And it was actually the Mine Train and Lark Flume combo, which you got Silver Flume, the Flume ride.
Yeah.
And then you have the
Tren de la Mina.
Tren de la Mina, which is it's Diablo Tren de la Mina, which is located in the Mexico area. And originally the entrance was in the Mexico area that bordered the Far West land, which also Far West is where Silver River is. And that was all supposed to be one giant mountain of a roller coaster and flume ride, which makes a lot of sense because when you're at PortAventura and you ride the flume ride, you're going through the flume, and all around you is the Mine Train, and it just looks like there was supposed to be more. Like there's a bunch of, metal superstructure, and it just looks like there was supposed to be a giant mountain there.
And I don't think there's any concept art that we have found of the attraction, but what you can find is the park map from 1995 that clearly shows a mountain structure. almost all of the flume was obscured from view in this version of the concept. The mine train would pass through the mountain once or twice, but really I think it was mostly for the flume in a sense. Because when you look at the maps from opening, and it's like, I mean, apparently Sven told us that they cut the budget on the mountain so that they could spend more money on Dragon Con and make it a B&M. Originally, Dragon Con was going to be
Vekoma Looper,
essentially like Gul'Drik's, but with an 8th inversion, and they cut budget elsewhere in the park to splurge on a B&M, which I think a lot of people would agree was a good choice. But yeah, so they lost the funding on the mountain, and then they never decided to add it again. I think they were happy with the kinetic nature of how the flume and the mine train turned out anyway. There may have really been no need to put them in a mountain, even though it would have looked cool from the outside. You have to do a lot on the inside of a decorative showpiece like that to really justify it. And I think, like, I love the flume. I wouldn't change anything about those rides except, you know, not being able to choose your own row on the mine train or any of the other coasters at this park. So I'd say even though the mountain was cool and an interesting, like, little tidbit about the future or about the ride's past and the development of this attraction, I think it's perfectly fine the way that it is.
And then next up on our list is Dragon Mountain.
Dragon Mountain.
At Marineland, Canada. Or Niagara Falls, whatever they call themselves. Don't go here.
They did the absolute most with this ride.
But it was a cool concept.
They had to develop. So they did all the terraforming and stuff for Dragon Mountain was done from scratch to build this ride. So they didn't just build a showpiece mountain and put a coaster in it. They actually built a physical little mountain
from dirt.
Yeah. From dirt. And built the roller coaster through. I mean, the amount of money that they spent on this thing.
When it opened, it was the world's longest steel coaster.
Yeah.
And, the stuff it does, I mean, it has a bunch of underground tunnels. It has once in a lifetime.
This is another roller coaster tycoon-y kind of project. Like, you could really build this ride to the exact specifications of Roller Coaster Tycoon if you wanted. And so the ride was so... This is another example of a ride just going so over budget that they couldn't do... They built it as much as they could. The ride always conceptualized going through a volcano, or maybe more of like a caldera. It's a big, wide, volcano-ish looking thing that you do a helix through, and that took a long time to come. It was like more than 20 years later they finally actually added the... volcano set piece around it, and it still looks bad.
And then after the volcano is another entrance to yet another tunnel, and then you go through a tunnel through the mountain, and the backside of it you were supposed to go through a replica of the Niagara Falls. And when they tell you they made a replica of the Niagara Falls, they built a giant turn. I mean, you can't imagine how big this turn is.
Yeah.
And half of it was supposed to be encased by rockwork, where the waterfall would be on one side of you.
Yeah.
You would come out of the waterfall, and the waterfall would be on the other side of you. And you would just be going through this giant, I mean, practically a rim of waterfall.
It was a perfect horseshoe,
massive element of
that
the ride.
reflected the natural falls. But yeah, not only did that not get built, but it was they could never hope to finish that set piece.
In fact, they had pieces there sitting there for decades of just like raw steel that was supposed to be covered in rockwork and waterfalls that was never finished. And it looked ugly as shit for 20 years until finally they just took some of that steel away. But yeah, the ride it's a really cool roller coaster. It's a terrain ride, a classic aero that just does the most. Really cool underground tunnels. It has a bow tie, the only bow tie in the world, which is almost like a Batwing element, but you exit on the opposite side of the element. And it's cool. It's very cool. But, oh my god,
it's like looking at the
more.
Niagara Falls portion of the ride, it was like, it's so clear how the entire ride's layout was dictated by the desire to do, where like you come out of the tunnel and you do that first like quarter turn that would have been under the water, like the curtain of water, and then the mid-course brake run would have been in the rockwork, and then you would pop out the other side and the water would be... You'd like wrap around the water. It would have been really cool.
Well, no, you're supposed to be inside the waterfall,
right?
And then the rockwork, and then pop out of the waterfall on the other side. Yeah, crazy.
Like right there was like where the mid course was.
Craziness.
It was probably they were probably very sad at the time to like go through the trouble of designing this roller coaster to have that feature and then not be able to actually follow through with that. But even the ride as is, like Sean said, is still a really cool, lovable ride. Oh yeah, you can see there.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Where like by the time we rode it, all of that had been removed.
Yeah, but that sat there for years.
Yeah,
and it's just so massive. I can't believe it's just massive.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is another one of those rides. And now we're jumping back to Spain.
Ambition and creativity.
And we're going to Superman at Parque Warner, which is a really cool floorless coaster with a unique layout, which we love. Great pacing, no mid-course brake run, giant airtime hill. Everything about it. We have a whole episode on Parque Warner. Won't go into too much. But it was actually conceptualized to be what kind of model again? Was it a clone of Scream?
It was going to be very similar to... So there is a... I can't even find this again, but I found it the first time we went to Parque Warner... for Batman, so the first time this year, there is a version of the Parque Warner park plan, the whole map of the park, and you can tell it's an older concept. Batman and Coaster Express are there. Stuntfall hadn't been added to the concept yet, which is, many people know that was like one of the last things that they added to the park there at the very end. I mean, the first generation, those Vekoma inverted boomerangs, the giant ones, they weren't even like a thing yet when the park was designed. So it was like that was really like the most state-of-the-art thing at the park when it opened, because it was newer technology than anything that had been put together for the park at the time. But there is a park map, or not even a park map, but like a model, a schematic, a blueprint of a version of the park from probably still in the 90s gestation, maybe 2000, where the layout for Superman is clearly not an exact clone of Medusa at Discovery Kingdom, but an augmented clone. It was pretty much identical, except that instead of having the little elbow after the pre-drop, it just went straight down, as it does currently. But like it had this, like the sea serpent, and then the corkscrews separated by the little helixes and stuff like that was all there. It was very, very clearly based on Discovery Kingdom's layout. I don't know what possessed them to make that change. I'm glad they changed it, because I love Superman.
But I also love Medusa, though.
But I also love Medusa.
And like the sea serpent. Like Medusa and Superman and Parque Warner are both some of the funnest floorless coasters, because they do things just a little differently. You know, like they're just quite unique in that sense.
Like, considering how good Medusa is, I'm surprised that they felt the need to change the design of it at all. But it was also really cool for them to get a totally custom ride. Which, for the record, I like that ride better than Dragon Con, and I wish I didn't, because I wanted to like Dragon Con better.
Oh yeah, Superman is just so good.
Superman just runs so much better.
All right, and then next on our list we have Accelerator at Knott's Berry Farm. So the concept of current Accelerator is honestly pretty true to what we got. But once upon a time, Knott's Berry Farm was planning on expanding way out into the south parking lot, way past Ghost Rider, and build a space-themed land with a launched roller coaster that did the most and was themed to going all around these planets. And that eventually, I think, is what became Accelerator in the existing park. But it could have been really cool, because not only was it just Accelerator, there was supposed to be aviaries, and there was supposed to be like just giant park expansions, and then the water park was supposed to be like a whole different size, shape, and whatever. Knott's was really planning on like fighting Disney head on with all these concepts, and it ended up nothing ended up being ever built. But that was really cool, and I can only imagine, because Accelerator is one of the better intimate hydraulic launch coasters out there. I can only imagine what it would have been if it was an even longer layout.
Yeah.
And on the same topic, we have Pony Express, which Pony Express feels to me like it was a very last-minute choice. It didn't require almost any restructuring in the park. It just kind of fit, on either side of the train tracks of the train that runs through the park. And then it just kind of hovers over the midway for a quick second. It's a very short ride. I mean, Pony Express is very short.
Very short.
Oh my God, for everyone complaining about Tron. Pony Express is like a fourth of Tron. It's so short. But it was actually conceptualized to be a Maverick 2.0, because when Maverick was being built, they had so many issues with it. They actually ended up not building an Intamin launch coaster like Maverick, which In a way, it's kind of sad because I think at the end of the day, Maverick turned out to be one of the Cedar Fair's biggest successes. But it was supposed to go all around the Rapids ride, Bigfoot Rapids back then. Now it's Calico River Rapids, I think is the official name.
Yeah.
And that's where the Maverick-esque roller coaster was supposed to go all around, which I think would have been a really, really cool fit. Would have also have been themed to the Wild West. Would have probably had a station in a similar location that we currently find Pony Express station. Would have just been a much bigger, longer, more expensive ride that unfortunately we didn't get.
It's just sad looking at all the... There's like Knott's Berry Farm is one of those parks that had their eye on the prize. That some of the stuff that they wanted to do, and some of the concepts that were developed for turning it into a resort and doing all this stuff was just so amazing and sad that like none of it happened. But still, we got some beautiful concept art out of it.
And then, last but not least, I'm going to let Alex take the lead.
So
is
perhaps
one of the wildest,
one of the most far-fetched and like difficult to believe. So Efteling, famous for their dark rides, their thematics. Efteling is famous for a lot of things, and not the least of which being their Python looping coaster, which was a cultural phenomenon comparable to like when Knott's Berry Farm opened the Corkscrew and when Magic Mountain opened Revolution. These looping coasters, this was the one. It opened in 1980. Was it 1980? 1981. It was 1981. Python opened in 1981, and it was a quadruple loop roller coaster. It had the most inversions of any roller coaster in Europe by a big margin. I don't think Europe had many looping coasters of any kind by then. If they did, it was, one or two loops max. Python was a total massive icon. And in the 90s, they got this idea. This was actually, I think, a direct result, not only just of Disneyland Paris, but of Space Mountain, From the Earth to the Moon. Efteling got this crazy idea to expand the existing Python roller coaster by like 200%. Where the ride would have started out as it did originally, but then right where the double loops lead into the turnaround for the corkscrews, it would have veered off, done a hill, and then dove underground, under the midway, and then popped out, like, roughly around where the entrance of the Lincoln to Hollander is, into a sidewinder that popped out of the ground, and then into a mid-course brake run that was kind of perpendicular to where the current brake run and transfer area, basically right where the entrance of Python is. So if you've ridden Python and you're walking into the ride, there would have been a mid-course brake run directly on top of you that then would have fed the train into a second lift hill, a taller lift hill, that would have then led to and these ones were parallel to this. These two lift hills were like, if you remember Twisted Twins at Kentucky Kingdom, this is kind of what it reminds me of the two lift hills like intersecting each other parallel-wise in sort of like an X shape. It would have led to a big sweeping curving drop and then into a huge airtime camelback hump that then would have dove down into a dirt turn and then another airtime hill and then up into another mid-course brake run. And then it would have dove down into like a Drachenfire-esque cutback element, or as Vekoma calls it, a tongue, because Space Mountain in Paris has the only documented instance of a tongue element on a Vekoma. The tongue then would have fed you into a new double corkscrew that would have intersected the double loops Vortex Kings Island style, and then come back around and fed itself into not one but two helixes, the first being a new helix sort of nested inside of the original turnaround after the vertical loops, and then positioned you into the old helix, the finale helix that went into the brake run.
And so, like, the reality of this ride is the only thing that was supposed to remain was like station, lift hill, drop, double loop, and then the final helix and brake run. Cutting out the corkscrews,
the old corkscrews,
and the original turnaround after the vertical loops, and replacing it with a roller coaster. I mean, the size of practically 5
I'm in love with
pound.
the
Crazy.
Wildness of this. I mean, the absolute audacity. And you guys, like, this wasn't just
an idea. Like, it was conceptualized. Vekoma had the blueprints. Far. There's blueprints available online. If you go to Eftopedia, there's a whole Python Plus page where you can see the actual blueprints from Vekoma. There's conceptualized studio renderings. There's smaller drawings of it. There's where the freaking shop would have been.
I mean,
all the crazy stuff.
It's well, the first time I saw this, I thought it was just some like random fans like no limits pie in the sky nonsense layout, and then I realized that this was actually something that Vekoma and Efteling worked on for quite some time before they finally decided that it maybe wasn't the best use of funds. Like maybe just build a new roller coaster entirely that's going to increase the capacity of the park. After this, I don't think it was long after this plan was canceled that they built Focal Rock instead as their response to Space Mountain.
I think, like, hindsight, I'm like, yeah, cool, but I don't know if that was ever financially a great idea to do that. You could have just built an extra ride and marketed that.
Yeah.
But all things considered, one of the coolest concepts of what could have been that really got quite far.
Easily the coolest thing on this episode because it's just so wild.
And with that, we end this episode of Crazy Rides, Crazier Concept. If you have any concepts that we didn't mention, feel free to send to us on social media.
We'll do another one of these.
We'll definitely do one.
We can gather enough cool concepts of other rides. And
you can message us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or whatever, X these days. Instagram, Threads, wherever you find us. And wherever you're listening, we'd love for you to leave us a review, 5 stars preferably. And we will see you guys next week. Thank you for listening. Bye.
Bye.